A Department of Ed shutdown order coming today. And it is coming at the, interesting time when they just laid off half of Department of Ed's workforce. So what does this mean? Well, first of all, the order is going to be signed next to governors of Republican-led states like Florida, Ohio, etc. So we are going to be seeing this shutdown order coming, we believe today. It was kind of teased that it was going to come earlier, but then they retracted it. And so then we started thinking, well, are they just bluffing? Are they just messaging? Like, what are they actually doing? And now it seems like this order is actually definitely going to happen. It sort of seems like what they wanted to do was lay off a bunch of people first before writing that executive order out, perhaps because they knew it was going to get challenged in the courts, and they wanted to try to lay people off first before filling out that order. Now, the order specifically says that the Secretary of Education shall shut down the department to the maximum extent permitted by law. So what that is doing is that is essentially admitting that they cannot just shut down the Department of Ed. That is saying that basically anything that they can identify that is not statutorily required for Department of Ed to do, they will cease doing, right? And then anything that is required in the statute, they have to do because it's in the statute and they don't have the votes to change it. So, you might say, Travis, how's there any good news here at all? Are you crazy or something? And I would say, well, yeah, the good news is that they are surrendering according to what the law says, because the order specifically says to the maximum extent permitted by law. Now, that's obviously going to be a battle. There's obviously going to be lawsuits over this. There already are lawsuits over this. And what is permitted under the law is probably going to be subject to the interpretation of what the courts would permit. But it does specifically state maximum extent permitted by law, which means all of the stuff about IDR, PSLF, all the things where the Secretary of Education has mentioned like 35, 34 times in those regulations. They can't just stop doing those things. Now, they did try to lay off a bunch of staff. About 1/3 of all the federal student aid staff got laid off. So that means there's not going to be very many people looking at the ombudsman email. There's not going to be very many people looking at the customer complaints email. There's not going to be that many people working with servicers to speedily get people processed for loan forgiveness, right? And perhaps that's by design because the administration doesn't support loan forgiveness, right? So they're going to be trying to move slower on discharging loans. They're going to be putting a larger burden of proof on borrowers. Borrowers are going to have to know a lot more than they ever have before. What is your payment count? What is your credit based off the terms of the IDR waiver? What is your proper PSLF amounts that you should have, right? People can know that by looking at their NSLDS files. They might have to manually count things. They might have to be educated and learn how to do it themselves. They might have to, work with folks, like a student loan planner that can help them, but it's going to be, borrowers are just going to have to be a lot more self-advocates than they ever have been before, right? I think the Biden administration's position was sort of like, we want to get as many people forgiveness as easily as possible. That was basically their position. And so if you look at the stuff like their proof of income documentation, the Biden administration, always sort of had the idea of, well, we don't really care. Like, if we have like some high income people that get lower IDR payments than they should be getting because we try to make the process really easy so that lower income people have an easier time getting access to income driven repayment, that's a trade-off that we're willing to make. That's kind of what the Biden position was over and over again. So that's why you see things in the IDR recertification application with the Biden administration where they changed the language online to just, submit, an example of your bank account or your wages or a letter from your employer. They tried to make it super flexible so that you could essentially say whatever you wanted to, and probably they're never going to check anybody. So that was the way the Biden administration handled things. But the way I expect the Trump administration to handle things is by the absolute most specific letter of the law humanly imaginable. So if there's any room to limit loan forgiveness programs, if there's any room to make borrowers pay more under the terms of the actual law, they're going to do that. So that's why when you do IDR recertifications, if you are submitting one via paper, such as to your servicer portal, you do need to, if you use alternative documentation and you're not submitting a tax return, you do need to make sure you account for all sources of taxable income. You do not want to do a lot of these sort of strategies that some of these other groups will tell you to do, like deliberately max out your 401k and submit a pay stub with a income that is from that one pay period where you were maxing out your 401k to make it look like you made no money. Like, that's not going to work in this new administration, right? I personally believe that any place that tells you to do something like that is playing with fire and hoping that you don't get audited, because if you do, you could be screwed. So I think that people need to be really careful. You need to try to, whenever possible, use tax returns. If you don't use tax returns to recertify your income, you want to be extra careful that you've documented, a reasonable picture of your income, which you can absolutely do. You can absolutely save a lot of money with loopholes. Don't get me wrong, right? You can absolutely show only what you need to show. You can only show, your if you're in a community property state and your spouse makes a lot more than you on your tax return, you can just truthfully state, my tax return's not reflective of my actual taxable income. My actual taxable income is, X amount of wages plus X amount of K1 income, and here's my signed letter to prove it, right? So you just have to be careful. You just have to be knowledgeable that, think about a scenario where, they identify quote unquote waste, fraud, and abuse with IDR programs, right? If they do that, you do not want to be one of the people that they identify in that random, AI driven effort. You know what I mean? It's just not worth it. So, I had a couple cases this past week where people were like incorrectly approved for PSLF certifications, for example. And I've had people that, were submitting only their wage, sources of income and not all of their wages plus their K1 income that are business owners, right? And so the reality there is just, my advice is, under this new administration, don't play with fire. Follow the rules, follow all the loopholes that we know exist that are legitimate, that are based on the statutes, right? And, when we see scary headlines like Department of Ed shutdown order, you have to think about the context. The context is Trump is announcing this with a bunch of other governors. Why is he announcing it with a bunch of governors? It's because what they care about is K through 12 education with this order. They don't care about higher ed all that much. The higher ed stuff, the main goal they have is, let's be more restrictive. And the reality is they can do a lot of things through executive orders and actions, but when the rubber meets the road and you see this reconciliation bill come out in the House, you are going to see enormous pressure campaigns against Republicans in swing districts. It's just reality. If you look at the 2 or 3 vote margin in the House that they have, I've identified like about 10 Republican swing districts with very large employer universities in there that are extremely exposed to plus loan borrowing. And when those schools realize that they could face severe financial strain or even close in these school districts if they do reform or block Parent Plus or Grad Plus loan programs, those schools are going to reach out hardcore to their representatives, and there's going to be a lot more fear politically from passing some of these provisions, right? So we're still in the honeymoon phase. We're still in the first 100 days of the new administration. We're still in the maximum, like, yeah, sure, whatever you want to do, go ahead and do it kind of deference that a lot of times is shown to a new administration, even by the courts and such, right? And, I think that what's going to happen is we're going to start hitting that grinding gears that are going to slow them down a lot once we get into the reality of the legislative process with budget reconciliation later this spring and early this summer. And, I understand there's a lot of people out there that are really frustrated right now that are trying to change, out of the save plan forbearance into the IBR plan. And people are frustrated that they won't even play by the actual rules right now, right? And I definitely have empathy for that view. And I'm sorry that y'all are going through it. But I will say this, in student loans, what I've learned is nothing is forever. It's always changing. It's always annoying. It's always all over the place. And even something that's super annoying or even something that's super good tends to have a fairly limited window on it. So I would have to just say I preach patience right now. Before we know it, there are some lawsuits going on right now that are brought by like American Federation of Teachers and others that are trying to force the administration to reopen the IBR plans. So that's why I say we just have to be patient. We have to do everything that we can in our power to, continue getting forgiveness credit, or at least having peace and growing our net worths while the 0% save forbearance is in place. So at least you're not losing ground in terms of your loan balance growing, hopefully right now, right? And if you have to recertify and you can't, well, you don't have control over that. That's not your fault. So you just do your best. Maybe you do an online portal application with paper through the servicer portals, but you just do your very best. And yes, it's okay to recertify income between jobs. If you lose, your current taxable income for any reason, even if it's briefly, you can go usually you go to studentaid.gov/IDR to recertify to get a loan payment, but right now you might have to do it manually through the servicer portal, and it still might not even work. So we're going to keep you protected during this confusing time, and we're going to keep you informed. And so I'm so grateful that you follow Student Loan Planner. If you have any comments or questions about this executive order coming today for Department of Education shutting down and what it means for you, just put it in the comments. And thank you again for following Student Loan Planner.